Imagine for a moment that everything you were taught about the crucifixion of Christ was only a symbol, a veil hiding a much deeper revelation about human consciousness. Think, what if the cross was never meant to be understood as a tool of suffering, but as a mirror of the inner transformation every soul must endure to awaken from the illusion of separation? What if the true message of Jesus was not about death, but about the liberation of the divine spark within us? The same spark Spinoza believed was identical to God itself. Welcome to a journey few dare to take, one that will challenge everything you thought you knew about Christianity, philosophy, and the very nature of reality. In this video, we will uncover the most hidden secret of Christianity, a truth that philosophers, mystics, and seekers have whispered across centuries. We will explore how Baruch Spinoza, one of the most misunderstood thinkers of all time, unveiled the metaphysical essence behind the crucifixion, not as a historical tragedy, but as a cosmic allegory of divine awakening. Stay until the end, because the final revelation is the most powerful of all, and it may completely change the way you see life, death, and God. Before we begin, if you are fascinated by ancient wisdom, hidden history, and the spiritual knowledge that connects philosophy and mysticism, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and share this video with others who are seeking the same truth. What you are about to hear may awaken something ancient inside you, a memory buried deep within your soul. Let us begin. Spinoza was born in 17th century Amsterdam, during an age when religion dominated every aspect of life, yet he dared to look beyond dogma. He questioned the image of a distant God ruling from the heavens, and instead proclaimed that God is the universe itself, infinite, eternal, and present in every form of existence. His philosophy was revolutionary, but also deeply dangerous. To say that God and nature were one was to dismantle the entire framework of religious authority. But Spinoza saw something the church could not, that divinity was not to be worshipped from afar, but realized from within. Now think about this. What if Jesus taught the same thing? What if his entire message was the same truth that Spinoza would later articulate, that the kingdom of God is not a place to be reached after death, but a state of consciousness to be realized here and now? When Jesus said, "The kingdom of God is within you," he was not speaking metaphorically. He was revealing a metaphysical law, the same law that Spinoza would later express through pure reason, that the divine and the human are not separate, but different expressions of the same infinite substance. Could it be that this is the real meaning behind the crucifixion? Not merely an act of sacrifice, but the symbolic death of the illusion that we are separate from God. In this light, the cross is not a punishment, but a portal, the moment in which human consciousness surrenders to the eternal unity of all things. For centuries, religious institutions have taught the crucifixion as an event of pain, guilt, and divine wrath. But Spinoza's understanding of God leaves no room for wrath or punishment. To him, God does not judge. God is all things. If that is true, then the crucifixion cannot be about divine vengeance. It must be about divine realization. It must be a moment in which humanity witnesses the ultimate truth, that life and death are not opposites, but two sides of the same eternal being. Let's pause here and reflect. When you see the image of the cross, what do you really see? Do you see an instrument of torture or a symbol of transformation? Could it be that the nails and the wounds are metaphors for the human ego being dissolved so that the soul can awaken to its divine nature? Spinoza once wrote, "The more we understand, the more we love." He believed that understanding reality leads not to fear, but to reverence. And when we apply this to the story of Jesus, everything changes. The crucifixion becomes not an act of despair, but an act of infinite love, the love that dissolves the illusion of separation between creator and creation. Every great mystic in history, from Meister Eckhart to Jacob Boehme, hinted at this same secret, that the true resurrection is the rebirth of divine consciousness within us. Spinoza, through philosophy, gave this mystical insight a rational form. He revealed that to truly understand the cross, we must look not to the heavens, but inward, into the structure of existence itself. So ask yourself, could it be that Jesus and Spinoza were pointing to the same eternal truth, expressed in different languages, one through faith, the other through reason? Could it be that what died on the cross was not the Son of God, but the illusion of a world divided from its source? In the next part, We will dive even deeper into this revelation, exploring how Spinoza's concept of Deus sive Natura, God or nature, reveals the true metaphysical nature of the crucifixion, and how this understanding can completely transform your perception of spirituality and reality itself. To understand the secret Spinoza revealed, we must first see how radically different his view of God was from the one most of Christianity had built upon for centuries. For the Church, God was an external ruler, separate, personal, and capable of anger, mercy, and judgment. For Spinoza, that was the greatest misunderstanding humanity ever created. He said that to imagine God as a person is to limit the infinite. For him, God is not a being among beings, but being itself, the substance of existence, the eternal presence that sustains all things, including our own consciousness. When Spinoza declared Deus sive Natura, God or nature, he was not equating divinity with the physical world alone. He was pointing to the essence behind all phenomena, the infinite intelligence that expresses itself through every form of matter, thought, and emotion. In his vision, everything is God thinking through infinite modes, manifesting through infinite forms. Nothing exists outside of God, not even what we call sin, suffering, or death. Now think of the crucifixion in this light. The story of Jesus on the cross, when stripped of dogma, mirrors the human journey through awakening. The body suffers, the ego resists, but consciousness witnesses. And at the moment of surrender, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit, something extraordinary happens. The illusion of separation dissolves. The individual self, long convinced it was isolated and powerless, merges with the infinite consciousness that Spinoza called God. This, then, is the true crucifixion, not the death of a man, but the death of illusion. It is the moment when the human mind stops identifying with form and recognizes itself as an expression of the eternal substance. The cross becomes the meeting point of heaven and earth, matter and spirit, time and eternity. Spinoza never spoke of Jesus as a divine being in the traditional sense, but he saw him as the highest example of human perfection, one whose mind was united with the infinite intellect of God. In Ethics, he writes that the human mind can be of such a nature that it is the adequate expression of God's infinite essence. To Spinoza, Jesus was not a figure to be worshipped, but a state of consciousness to be realized. Imagine if the crucifixion, rather than being the symbol of punishment for sin, was the symbol of the awakening of this divine consciousness within humanity. Imagine that Jesus was showing us not how to die, but how to transcend. Each nail driven into his flesh represents an attachment of the ego being released. Every wound, a layer of illusion falling away. The crown of thorns becomes the burning awareness of divine truth, piercing through human thought. Could it be that this is the secret Christianity lost? That the cross was never meant to be feared, but understood as the doorway to enlightenment? What if resurrection was not a miracle that happened to one man, but a process available to all who dare to die to their illusions? Spinoza's reasoning dismantles the hierarchy between the divine and the human. If God is the essence of all, then the separation between creator and creation is an illusion of the limited mind. The crucifixion, seen through this lens, becomes the dramatic unveiling of this truth. The physical suffering of Jesus mirrors the metaphysical struggle of every soul attempting to awaken from ignorance. The final breath, that moment of total surrender, is the complete realization of unity. When we truly grasp this, a profound shift occurs. The story of Jesus ceases to be external history and becomes an inner map. The cross is no longer wood and nails, it is the human condition itself. Each of us carries our own cross in the form of desires, fears, and attachments, and each of us at some point is called to rise beyond it. The death that follows is not annihilation, but transcendence. Now ask yourself, what if the Church feared this truth because it rendered priests unnecessary? What if the real danger of Spinoza's philosophy and of Jesus' teaching was that it freed the human being from dependence on external authority? When you understand that God is not somewhere else but within and around you, no temple, ritual, or mediator is needed. That realization alone is revolutionary. It restores the sacred to every breath, every thought, every moment of being alive. That is why both Jesus and Spinoza were considered heretics. Both revealed that the kingdom of God is not controlled by religion. It is the very consciousness through which you perceive reality. It is the awareness that there was never any separation to begin with. When Jesus said, "It is finished," it was not an expression of defeat. It was the proclamation of enlightenment. The illusion had ended. The veil had fallen. The human had remembered its divine origin. Spinoza, centuries later, would echo this same state of realization in pure philosophical language. For him, the enlightened mind does not beg God for mercy. It understands itself as a mode of God's infinite perfection. Reflect on this. How would your life change if you stopped seeing yourself as a sinner and started seeing yourself as an expression of the divine substance? How much fear would dissolve if you realized that God does not demand worship, but awareness? The secret of the crucifixion, as revealed by Spinoza's insight, is not about suffering but awakening. It is the alchemy of consciousness, the transformation of pain into wisdom, of limitation into eternity. And yet, there is something even deeper hidden within this mystery, something that Spinoza hinted at but never said directly. In the next part, we will uncover that hidden layer, the metaphysical mechanism behind resurrection itself, and how it reveals the eternal cycle through which consciousness evolves, dies, and is reborn, both in the cosmos and within the human soul. When we look deeper into the mystery of resurrection, through the eyes of philosophy, mysticism, and divine logic, we find that it was never meant to be understood as a supernatural event, but as the inevitable unfolding of a cosmic law. The death of form always precedes the awakening of essence. This is not merely a story about a man returning from the tomb. It is the archetype of consciousness rising beyond the boundaries of time. In Spinoza's vision, everything that exists is a mode of one infinite substance, God or nature. Nothing truly dies because nothing truly exists outside of this totality. When a wave disappears, the ocean does not lose anything. It simply changes form. Likewise, what we call death is only transformation, the dissolution of a temporary pattern into its eternal source. And this, precisely, is the metaphysical truth encoded in the resurrection. Jesus' resurrection, then, was never a suspension of natural law. It was the ultimate revelation of it. His return from death symbolizes the awakening of the divine intelligence within matter. It is consciousness remembering itself as eternal. The stone rolled away from the tomb is the veil lifted from the mind. In that moment, death itself is unmasked, not as an enemy to be feared, but as a transition into higher awareness. Spinoza wrote, "The human mind cannot be absolutely destroyed with the body, but something of it remains which is eternal." He was pointing to the same truth that the mystics called the light of the soul. In every human being, there is an aspect that transcends time, untouched by decay. The resurrection is the moment we awaken to that realization. It is the rebirth of the eternal within the temporary, the rediscovery of the infinite within the finite. Think of this for a moment. What if resurrection is not an event of the past, but an ongoing process of consciousness in the present? Every time you transcend fear, every time you rise above pain or ignorance, something within you resurrects. The old self dies, and a greater awareness is born. Could it be that the second coming of Christ is not a future event, but the awakening of Christ consciousness within humanity, the same universal intelligence Spinoza identified as the essence of all reality? This perspective changes everything. It means that the story of Jesus is not a distant tale to be worshipped, but a living pattern to be embodied. The crucifixion and resurrection are not just moments in history, they are stages in the evolution of the soul. Spinoza's philosophy gives this process a logical structure. Every being, by the necessity of divine nature, seeks to persist and expand in existence. He called this the conatus, the inner drive to realize the fullness of one's essence. The soul's resurrection is the culmination of this drive, the moment when self-realization reaches its divine completion. Now let us look at the esoteric symbolism hidden in this process. The cross represents the intersection of opposites, spirit and matter, eternity and time, the infinite and the finite. When Jesus ascends from the cross, it is not escape, but integration. The horizontal beam of matter is united with the vertical beam of spirit. This union gives birth to the resurrected consciousness, the state in which the human no longer sees duality, but unity in all things. Mystics across traditions have recognized this. The Hermetic texts describe the same principle. As above, so below, as within, so without. The soul, bound by the illusion of opposites, must die to duality to perceive the one. Spinoza, through reason, arrived at the same realization, that all distinctions are only modes of a single infinite reality. When Jesus rose, he did not leave the world. He saw it for what it truly was, divine in every particle, and this is where the greatest secret lies. Resurrection is not about escaping the material world, but sanctifying it. Spinoza's God is not beyond nature, but within it. Likewise, the risen Christ is not a ghost detached from creation, but the living proof that spirit and matter are one continuum of being. To awaken to this truth is to resurrect while still alive, to see through the illusions of separation and recognize every moment as sacred. Pause and ask yourself, what part of you is still in the tomb? What aspect of your consciousness remains bound by the stone of fear, guilt, or ignorance? To rise is to move the stone yourself, to allow divine light to flood the hidden chambers of your being. When you understand resurrection as the expansion of awareness, Spinoza's rational mysticism and Jesus' spiritual message merge into a single revelation. God is not something to be reached. God is the totality in which you already exist. The crucifixion reveals the death of illusion. The resurrection reveals the immortality of truth. Together they form the eternal cycle of awakening. It is said that after his resurrection, Jesus appeared to his disciples not as a spirit to be worshipped, but as a teacher reminding them of their own divine potential. You will do the works I have done, and greater. This is not metaphor. It is an invitation to continue the process of awakening, to become conscious creators within the infinite field of God's essence. Spinoza might have put it differently, but his conclusion was the same. Salvation is not given, it is realized. It is not a gift from above, but the awakening of understanding within. Blessed are those who understand, he might have said, for they have already risen. Yet there is one more layer to this mystery, the one that ties together Spinoza's vision of infinite substance and Jesus' revelation of divine love. Beyond the logic of existence, there lies the heart of being, the force that sustains the universe itself, love. In the next and final part, we will explore how love, not logic, is the ultimate key that unites Spinoza's God with the living Christ, and how this realization unveils the most hidden secret of Christianity itself. If reason was Spinoza's path to God, love was his destination. Beneath his logical precision and austere language, there pulsed an infinite tenderness toward existence itself. To him, the more one understood reality, the more one loved it. Because understanding dissolved the illusion of separation, love for Spinoza was not an emotion, but the direct recognition of unity. It was the awareness that every being, every moment, and every form of life is an expression of the same infinite substance. In that recognition, all fear vanishes, all judgment fades, and what remains is pure reverence for the mystery of being. Now think again of Jesus, not the distant figure nailed to wood, but the living consciousness that looked upon creation with infinite compassion. When he said, "Love your enemies," he was not preaching morality. He was describing metaphysical truth. To love one's enemy is to recognize that even the forces that oppose us are part of the same divine field. This is not forgiveness through weakness, but through vision. It is seeing beyond appearances into essence. Here lies the deepest bridge between Spinoza and Christ. Both saw that love is the ultimate perception of truth. Spinoza wrote, "He who loves God cannot desire that God should love him in return." This is perhaps one of the most misunderstood sentences in all philosophy. What he meant was that divine love is not transactional. It is not the love of one being for another, but the self-awareness of the infinite through its own expressions. God loving himself through the eyes of man, and man loving himself through the essence of God, a continuous, boundless circulation of being. In this light, the crucifixion becomes the supreme symbol of love, recognizing itself even in suffering. Jesus' words on the cross, "and forgive them, for they know not what they do," are the highest manifestation of divine consciousness. Awareness without resistance, compassion without condition. It is the soul seeing through illusion and understanding that even ignorance is part of the divine play. Spinoza would have said, "This is the mind perfectly united with God, perceiving all things under the aspect of eternity." The resurrection, then, is not the victory of the body, but of love. It is love transcending fear, love dissolving death, love awakening within matter as the heartbeat of eternity. To rise from the tomb is to recognize that life and death, joy and sorrow, light and shadow, all are expressions of the same infinite will to exist, to know, to love. This is the most hidden secret of Christianity, the truth that the cross and the resurrection are not about punishment and reward, but about unity and awakening. Jesus did not die to appease a wrathful God. He surrendered to reveal that God was never wrathful at all. The true atonement, at one ment, is the restoration of our awareness of oneness with the infinite. And Spinoza, through reason alone, arrived at the same revelation. When he spoke of the intellectual love of God, he was describing a state of consciousness in which knowledge and love become one. To understand existence is to love it. To love it is to become one with it. This is enlightenment, the same illumination that radiated from the resurrected Christ. It is not something to be worshipped from afar, but realized within. Imagine if humanity rediscovered this secret, that the divine is not external, but immanent, that salvation is not granted, but remembered, that love is not emotion, but the recognition of truth. How different our world would be. There would be no wars over doctrine, no fear of damnation, no separation between faith and reason. Science and spirituality would merge into one great act of reverence for existence. Philosophy would become prayer, religion would become understanding, and the human being would finally remember what it has always been, a living expression of the divine. Ask yourself, as you listen to these words, what is your own crucifixion? What part of you still believes it is separate from the infinite? What illusion are you still carrying that prevents you from resurrecting into the awareness of love? The cross stands not in history, but within each of us, the eternal point where the human and the divine meet. To awaken to that truth is to experience resurrection now, in this very moment. Spinoza's God is not a being to be feared, but the very life moving through your veins, the light behind your thoughts, the intelligence that dreams through your consciousness. And the Christ is not a man to be worshipped, but the eternal archetype of awakening, the spark of divine remembrance that lives within every soul. Together they whisper the same truth through different languages. You and the divine are one. There was never any separation, only the illusion of it. When this realization dawns, life itself becomes sacred. Every breath becomes prayer, every act becomes devotion. You no longer seek heaven elsewhere, for heaven is the awareness of unity. You no longer seek resurrection after death, for resurrection is the awakening from ignorance. You no longer seek love from another, for love is what you are. And so the circle closes. The crucifixion was not the end, it was the revelation. The resurrection was not the proof of power, it was the proof of unity. And Spinoza, through the clarity of reason, rediscovered what the mystics already knew, that the divine is not an object of faith, but the essence of being. The most hidden secret of Christianity is not hidden in texts or temples. It is hidden in you, in the silence behind your thoughts, in the awareness that observes all things. There, the Christ and the cosmos are one. There, Spinoza's God and Jesus' love are not different truths, but the same eternal voice saying, I am that I am. So remember this, to understand is to love, and to love is to awaken. The cross, the tomb, the resurrection, they are not distant stories. They are the stages of your own evolution. When you truly see this, you will realize what both Spinoza and Christ tried to tell humanity, that the ultimate revelation is not found in suffering, but in awakening, and that the kingdom of God has always been within you. Thanks for looking.